Over the last 22 months, I've covered a huge range of topics on this channel. It started in March of 2022 with a look at the Russian invasion and armed forces. And from there, I've tried to answer an ever broader array of questions, covering topics from arms markets to national strategies, to the lessons and observations that continue to flow from Ukraine. And one of the main reasons I've been able to do that is the immense support this channel has received from, well, all of you. And so today, as a Welcome to 2024 special, I want to change things up a bit. And instead of posing and answering my own questions, I want to answer yours. I put a call out for questions from the channel's patrons, and then tried to grab a few highly voted ones from a YouTube poll as well. And the results, to be honest, are diverse. On one hand, you've got serious questions on serious topics: tactical nuclear weapons, the employment of special forces in Ukraine, the future of counter-UAS technologies, or the applicability of robotics in defense manufacturing, plus a few more personal questions about me and how the channel functions. On the other hand, the highest voted question by a country mile was whether I would rather fight a duck the size of a Slava-class cruiser, or 1,000 Slava-class cruisers shrunk down to the size of a duck. And because I'm not one to shy away from a challenge, no matter how strange it is, I'm going to try and answer all of the above. So the way I've split this up, because this video, like the questions posed, contained a little bit of everything, is that I'm going to start with the more technical and serious questions, starting with those on Ukraine and then defense economics more broadly. Then I'm going to pivot the focus first to the channel, then to myself, and then finally some of the fun and silly stuff like gaming right at the end. And if you are a patron and don't see a question here today, don't worry. I'll try to make sure it surfaces again in the future. The big caveat I'll put up front though is that because this is a Q&A video, I'm going to be sweeping through topics pretty quickly, which means I won't have the same level of detail I usually try to. If an answer seems incomplete, that may be because it is, but I expect to be revisiting more than a few of the substantial topics we cover in the not-so-distant future. So with that said, let's kick off with some questions about the war in Ukraine. So the first question's on the role of Ukrainian and Russian special forces and military intelligence in Ukraine, and whether or not what we've seen from them differs in any way from what Western militaries have been doing with their SF elements over the last 2 decades. Okay, so small issue here that I'm sure will surprise all of you, but Ukraine and Russia tend to be a little bit secretive about what their special forces and intelligence units are doing. So everything we say now is probably going to be proven incomplete or incorrect later on, because it has to be based on what the two sides say about each other, plus what they do choose to disclose. With that caveat in place, 2 points stand out. The first is the use of special forces or special forces-like units as essentially elite infantry. We have visual evidence and Ukrainian claims of Russia expending Spetsnaz units in the assault infantry role back in 2022. There's plenty of reporting to back that up. We have visual evidence of what appear to be SOF units on the Russian side engaged in what looks like trench clearing. And we have examples of high-profile casualties, like the death of Colonel Polyakov, commander of the 14th Spetsnaz Brigade around Volodar, back in, I think, February 2023. Now, of course, there are a wide variety of special units, both in Russia and Ukraine, and their mission sets are very diverse. But if you're looking at this from an efficiency perspective, acting as assault infantry probably shouldn't be near the top of that mission list. The temptation for a commander to do this is probably understandable. If you're trying to take a position and you need infantry that can be relied upon to do it, then even though that's not what Spetsnaz or the Ukrainian SOF are there for, and it's immensely wasteful of elite personnel who have been trained to do far more complex missions, they are probably going to be more reliable and more dependable in that assault or defense role than a regular infantry unit. Now, however, we see more reports of special operations doing more nuanced jobs. On the Russian side, that might mean spotting for and adjusting artillery fire as forward observers, providing sniper support, leading counterattacks, or, and this is one of the interesting ones to me, operating drones. We've seen a lot of Lancet loitering munitions end up in the hands of and be operated by special Russian units. While on the Ukrainian side, we see special forces and military intelligence operate all sorts of drones. The problem both sides are likely to be grappling with, albeit to different degrees, is that these sort of personnel once lost are very hard to replace during wartime, or at least difficult to replace to the same standard as the pre-war operators. That said, more traditional, SOF-like operations no doubt continue. That includes things like sabotage and operations deep behind enemy lines, which we haven't just seen evidence of, it's occasionally been publicised by the relevant sides. And while yes, a lot of what we're seeing might look different to what Western units have been doing the last 2 decades, we do have to remember that the environment and requirements here are very different. Russian Spetsnaz doing counter-battery with Lancet or acting in an anti-armor role during counterattacks using ATGMs might be different from what NATO special operators did in Afghanistan, but if I might be so bold as to make a radical claim here, that might have something to do with the fact that the Taliban weren't exactly long on tanks and self-propelled howitzers. Next, I've got 3 more general questions about drones and robotics. The first is about the role of robotics in the defense industrial base and what role they're likely to play in the future. To paraphrase from the question, they can build cars, so why not artillery, tanks, planes, and drones? And what relevance might their use have in making sure that Ukraine is adequately supplied? There's a couple of answers here. Firstly, you do see a lot of robotics used in some military production. The most modern artillery ammunition plants, for example, can be chock full of equipment that you might describe as robotics. At the same time, however, look across military industry and you'll find a lot of tasks that look very manual. Go through a video of assault rifles being assembled by Kalashnikov workers in Russia, for example, and you're going to see some babushkas working by hand at individual workstations. Given the comparative cost between labour and capital equipment there, that kind of makes sense. One of the problems for robotics with a lot of military equipment is you need to have enough of a production run for it to be worth designing and investing in the robotic equipment to make the production process more efficient. If the US Air Force wanted 70,000 F-35s, you could Henry Ford the shit out of that production line. But designing and then building all of the equipment and facilities to make it possible is only worth it if the quantity is sufficiently high. And in some cases, you can argue one of the more damaging impacts of the peace dividend on the defence industrial base was that as order numbers dropped, many firms adopted production processes and economic models that were designed to be profitable and survivable at very low production rates, not maximally efficient per unit. So long story short, we do see a lot of robotics used in defence manufacturing, but often not as much as you might see in the mega factories that turn out, for example, civilian vehicles. And if you wanted to see something more like that being employed, you'd need a lot of capital availability up front, processes and designs that were developed with automation in mind, since often the complexity of a military product might itself be a barrier to potential automation. And if you really wanted the whole thing to take off, then you'd really need the order quantity and longevity to justify those investments. Question 2, how will militaries defend against swarm drones? I don't know. And the fact we don't really know yet is kind of horrifying. Now, I do want to make a distinction here between swarming drones and a swarm of drones. Swarming drones are those that are actively communicating with each other, coordinating their attack, and operating essentially as a unit. With those sort of drones, if you can disrupt the communication between them, their ability to swarm is much reduced. You haven't taken them out, but they can't do what they were designed to do. By contrast, if you're just talking about a swarm that is a large number of normal drones, that's in some ways a more difficult problem. Because even if you're able to use EW to sever their connection to their operator, it's possible, and I would say likely, that these systems are going to grow more autonomous and capable over time. And so even if they're not actively receiving instructions and are completely jammed, they might be able to go slam themselves into the nearest tank-shaped heat signature regardless. The area of UAS and counter-UAS development is very fast-paced at the moment. So for the moment, watch this space. And the final question on drones is, how has Ukraine's use of naval drones impacted ship defence thinking and doctrine for various navies around the world compared to current missile defence? And here, in terms of the long-term trajectory of this threat, I'd actually refer to last week's video on the crisis in the Red Sea. Because it's not just Ukraine that might be using these sort of technologies going forward, it's other actors as well. Reportedly, the Houthis just used one. In terms of the actual threat to warships, I think it's worth saying the technology being used by Ukraine at the moment is still in many ways pretty basic, pretty embryonic. Designs are iterating rapidly, there's a lot of civilian off-the-shelf technology being used, and I don't think it's even clear ultimately whether the kamikaze design will end up being what designers finally settle on. Because what we've seen so far is that a lot of Ukrainian drones that have been lost attacking Russian warships are lost during the final approach. That's the point where they're easier to spot, and the vessel's onboard gun systems or the crew's small arms can be used to engage them. There is probably a threat here, but it's not a completely alien one. A lot of navies, for example, train against the threat of small speedboats and attack craft, and they train to be able to engage those with a variety of systems, including onboard guns. So I don't think navies are really starting from zero when it comes to countermeasures. That said, there's a lot of development ongoing on both the sword and shield side of that particular equation. So once again, watch this space. Next question was a simple one on the Russian economy. What Ruble doing and what does it mean? I do want to take another look at some of the economic aspects of this war, particularly the energy war at some point in the near future. But for now, the simple answer is the United States dollar currently buys about 91 rubles. The number did briefly spike above 100, but the Russian central bank raised interest rates and imposed a variety of capital controls, which I think just highlights that as long as the Russian government is willing to continue to intervene to prop up the ruble, there is only so far it can fall. But just because it isn't falling doesn't mean economic pain isn't being inflicted because of the controls that have to be imposed to keep it there. If you take a long-term view, this really just represents a continuation of Vladimir Putin's long-term war against the ruble's value. In late 2013, before the Russian invasion of Crimea, a US dollar might buy 32, 33 rubles, something like that. Even when things had sort of leveled out by 2017, that figure had still increased to around 60. In December 2021, a US dollar was now buying around 73 rubles, and now, after nearly 2 years of full-scale war, massive interventions in the economy, increased interest rates, and a variety of capital controls, a US dollar buys 91 rubles, meaning that by that measure, the currency has lost nearly 2/3 of its value since the end of 2013. The Russian war economy in many ways has absolutely held together so far. Production levels will probably continue to increase, but in a sense, the war has kind of been a stomach wound for the broader economy, bleeding out capital, savings, and economic vitality, but sustained by the tremendous stimulus of military expenditure, basically serving as an ongoing blood transfusion that not only keeps the economy going, but in some sectors actually helps it grow. The problem is, what happens once that war spending and that stimulus has to stop? Up next, there were a couple of questions that basically said, "Hey Perun, do you have any interest in going over some of your old predictions and seeing which ones panned out and which ones didn't?" The answer is absolutely yes. So my open invitation there is if I made a prediction in the past that you would like me to revisit, please email me with a link and a timestamp or put it in a comment if you need to, so that I can go back and make sure it's included in a future review. At a really zoomed out level though, if we go all the way back to All Bling No Basics, that video had a couple of core contentions, which I think I called my controversial points at the time. The first was that the war between Ukraine and Russia was much closer than most people were describing it in February 2022, that this wasn't going to be a one-sided curb stomp and that Ukraine could put up a fight. And I think the 2 years of fighting that followed have very much borne that out. Contention 2 was that Russia had built the wrong sort of military for the sort of campaign they were trying to fight in February 2022. That one I absolutely stand by because even though there were some really dangerous moments for the Ukrainians in those opening days and weeks, it's also pretty clear that the Russian force wasn't well optimised for the plan it was being asked to execute. And contention 3 was that given the disparity in resources, if the West wanted to give Ukraine enough resources to push the Russians out, they could. The defining question wouldn't so much be economic or military potential as political will. And given what Ukraine has been able to achieve with the equipment it has been supplied, and at the same time, how restricted and slow that flow of equipment has sometimes been, I'd suggest that point wasn't just correct in early March 2022, it's probably still true now in the opening days of 2024. Then there was a cluster of questions which were basically, what has surprised you about the war so far? And to be honest, that could be an entire video. I'm surprised Prigozhin started his march on Moscow, I'm surprised he got as far as he did, I'm surprised he agreed to turn around, and I'm not at all surprised that his plane had an accident sometime afterwards. I've been continually surprised by the way Russia chooses to use its long-range precision weapons. I was surprised by the Ukrainian offensive at Kharkiv, and the list could go on. But one of the things that has surprised me that I think really stands out is just how quick and how dramatically the narrative around this war has shifted back and forth. My observation, watching Western media, is that we have seen a swing quite dramatically from a quick Russian victory being inevitable to a situation where Russia was suffering a humiliating defeat because Ukraine was managing to hold on to their capital city, to a point where Ukraine was expected to win a quick and dramatic victory, reclaiming all of their lost territory, back to a situation where you see Russia often assessed as winning, as long as it can manage to step over some now much, much lower bar. A recent example might be this article from the BBC, which says, quote, "President Putin, who personally ordered this invasion nearly 2 years ago, needs only to hold on to the territory he has seized, roughly 18% of Ukraine, to proclaim a victory," end quote. Which for me isn't an uncontroversial point because Putin claims to have annexed Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk and Donetsk, which means by that logic, just holding what he has means leaving Russian territory in Ukrainian hands. That sort of scenario absolutely wouldn't be a Ukrainian victory, but I don't think it would meet the Russian declared conditions of victory either. Then there was the second statement that, quote, "NATO has emptied its armouries and committed everything short of going to war in support of its ally Ukraine," end quote. That statement is just mathematically provably false. Now I'll accept there's an extent to which that statement might be subjective. You could argue that giving everything should mean Western budgets running at wartime levels or at least Cold War levels to try and support Ukraine. Instead, the commitments to date have been much, much lower. But when it comes to equipment, I'd argue there's really no room for equivocation. There are whole systems and classes of systems that Ukraine has requested that it hasn't received. From the mighty US military, which has thousands of Abrams tanks in service or storage, Ukraine has received so far, reportedly, 31. The announced sale of Abrams tanks to Romania was larger than the supply to Ukraine, And in some cases, countries have reportedly chosen to decommission military equipment rather than send it to Ukraine when requested. Like I've said before, we can discuss the reasoning, the politics, the consideration around these various supply decisions. But what has often surprised me when I'm watching what appears to be a very grim, mechanical, attritional conflict, in which tracking the numbers is important and trends tend to change relatively slowly, the narratives around how the war is going can flip multiple times per year. The next question jumps back to foreign policy again and asks, with elections in Slovakia and the Netherlands, which countries do you see as weak links for supporting Ukraine? And what about countries that are surprising or underrated in terms of their support? If I was to highlight two specific countries that might concern me if I was Ukraine, they would be Hungary because of that country's ability and willingness to block EU initiatives to assist Ukraine, and secondly, the United States, because the US is the most important supplier of arms and ammunition, and because their desperately needed aid package has been stalled since late 2023, with a likely very divisive election scheduled for November this year. At the other end of the spectrum, given we've already talked about countries like Poland, I'd nominate the Czech Republic, the various Nordic states, the Baltic states, and with an asterisk, Germany. Recently, Germany has really stepped up as a major provider of military assistance to Ukraine. They and other powers like the United Kingdom appear to be trying to do a lot to try and keep Ukraine supplied until US aid can resume fully. The reason for the asterisk is because Germany is still very selective in what kinds of systems it sends. You can have lots of very valuable, very useful German air defense systems and radars, for example, but no cruise missiles for you. I guess it's kind of like going to play golf, asking to borrow some clubs, and the guy behind the counter telling you that he'll happily lend you 20 putters. You're going to have everything you need if you make it to the green, but to get there, you better hope someone will lend you something else with a little more reach. Cough, Britain and France, cough. I've talked before about why German politics might help shape that particular phenomenon, but it'll be interesting to see how that evolves in 2024. Next, we had some questions on specific weapons and tools, Molotov cocktails and landmines. The first question was basically, early in the war we saw the Ukrainians preparing these huge numbers of Molotov cocktails. What role did they end up playing, and do they play a role now? Okay, so the answer here, as far as the evidence I've seen goes, is basically this. A Molotov cocktail is a relatively short-range emergency weapon. If you have a large supply of javelins, NLAWs, and anti-tank grenades and people who know how to use them, you're probably not mixing up Molotov cocktails. Likewise, if all of your engagements are being fought at long distance, no one's got the arm to piff that bottle 3 or 4 kilometers, and if you can find someone willing to fire a glass bottle full of gasoline out of a mortar or something in order to increase its range, I guarantee you won't find a second. The Molotov cocktail had a role in the earlier stages of war when we thought we might be seeing Ukrainian civilians and irregulars defending the streets of Kyiv against Russian armor. And in those chaotic early days, we did see some video of Molotov cocktail use. But now that you have relatively static battle lines on a very transparent battlefield with a lot of fires available, the Molotov just doesn't seem to have a place, with one potential exception. We've seen plenty of video of Molotov cocktails being used by civilians in acts of resistance behind the lines. Many of the attacks on Russian mobilization offices, for example, have been people throwing Molotov cocktails at them and trying to set them on fire. And some of the reasons that system might be the one being used are the same that drove the Ukrainians to fall back on them in the first phases of the invasion. The materials are everywhere, everyone can make one, and they're simple to use. Russian security services might be able to stop people getting their hands on high explosives, but good luck stopping someone in Russia getting their hands on a vodka bottle, some petrol, a rag, and a lighter. Throw bottle in direction of thing you want to burn is a pretty basic set of instructions that most people can understand, and so wherever the need for that sort of simplicity and accessibility outweighs all the issues with capability, those circumstances are where you're going to find the Molotovs. The next questions then were about landmines. Basically, are there any lessons or observations we're drawing watching how landmines are being used? And I've talked about landmines a lot before, and probably will do so again, but there are a couple of observations that stand out. The first is to express this in sword versus shield terms. When it comes to landmines in Ukraine, the mines and the techniques for using them are way ahead of the countermeasures. Mines are being used in truly massive quantities, but also in quite interesting ways. Yes, there are very deep, very dense fields of mines, but we've also seen the use of things like artillery-deployed mines to fill in areas that are being cleared or to lay mines behind an advancing force. We've seen mines being layered, we've seen the use of off-route anti-armor mines, and techniques like command detonation or mine stacking intended to counter clearing vehicles. We've even started to see a proliferation of drones that are intended not to clear mines, but to lay them. With little robotic systems, often wire-controlled so you can't exactly jam them, that can make the task of going out into the grey zone and laying new anti-tank mines much, much safer. In that context, neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians, but especially the Ukrainians, have anywhere near enough and effective enough mine-clearing equipment. And so we've seen General Zaluzhny say in his article that they need new mine-clearing options and equipment. We've seen experts suggest getting Ukrainian infantry access to things like the APOBs, which you can think of as basically a man-portable and operated Miklik, so that infantry launching small unit assaults over short distances actually have a tool to help limit some of the attrition they might take from anti-personnel mines. I think we first talked about APOBs in the first video on Bakhmut back in 2022, and since that point, mines have absolutely become more of a problem, not less of one. The unfortunate extension there is that if you're an international negotiator looking to push more countries to ban landmines, good luck. Because if there's an unfortunate lesson we might be taking out of some of the fighting in Ukraine so far, it's that burying so many explosives in the dirt that you turn warfare into a game of the floor is lava may be a very old tactic, but still sometimes an effective one. And finally for this section, we have what I'm calling the $75 billion question. This one came in from a Norwegian who said that the country has about 1.5 trillion US dollars in its sovereign wealth fund, and was basically asking, look, if you wanted to spend 5% of that fund, 75 billion US dollars, on the objective of defeating the Russian military in Ukraine, how would you spend it? First of all, fantastic stealth flex. Thanks for reminding the rest of the world that your country of about 5.5 million people has about 1.5 trillion US dollars in sovereign wealth savings. Secondly, I think used correctly, that sort of sum could make a tremendous amount of difference. I know it doesn't sound like a huge departure from the numbers we often hear. The US is talking about a Ukraine aid budget of about $60 billion in 2024, and the off-cited number for the European Union is north of 50 million euros. But here's the thing, those funds have to be spread over different demands and different times. The European Union plan spans over multiple years. The American plan has to cover different priorities. Aid funding might need to cover the cost of forward NATO deployments, investments in the domestic industrial base, and funding for Ukraine has to first cover certain baseline requirements before you can start talking about military aid. Ukraine needs humanitarian aid for its population, it needs to be able to keep its energy sector functional, and it needs macro-financial assistance because the country is running a deep deficit, paying for its troops and the operation of government during wartime conditions. So assuming those requirements are covered by the other aid packages, if you just take $75 billion and you plough it directly into military assistance specifically, then you're increasing the funds available for that purpose many, many times over, and you're probably going to end up in a situation for 2024 and 2025 where Ukraine has more funding available for new equipment than Russia does. If you want a strong negotiating position, that's actually really important to do because you need a strong burn rate in Russian equipment, and that they can't just realistically push through the losses through additional mobilizations, production, and reactivations. As for how you'd actually spend the money, I'd suggest asking the Ukrainians, but if it was up to me, I think you'd start with the basics, the lowest hanging fruit, where you can get the greatest return on your investment, and then as you fill each of those buckets up, you move on to the next one. Ukraine has a range of domestic drone production programs that need additional capital. Provide it. Get the production of FPVs and strike drones maximized and scaled as quickly as possible. Then you need to solve the munition requirements and you need to solve them sustainably. And that includes not just setting up additional production capacity, it means agreeing to supply new munitions, paying for them with this aid money in order to take some of the pressure off high-demand items like 155 shells. So high-quality long-range air-to-air and anti-air munitions to help push back the Russian Air Force and make it easier for Ukrainian forces to advance, better breaching and clearing equipment, and things like long-range precision munitions, air-launched cruise missiles for F-16 being near the top of the list. If you wanted to give the Ukrainians the ability to fire 100 cruise missiles against Russian targets every single month for an entire year, then depending on how you're calculating and defining your costs, $2.5 billion out of your $75 billion budget might do it. At that point, you're solving a lot of problems, but you're still only a fraction of the way through the funding, which is important because you want to close a lot of equipment gaps for the Ukrainian ground forces. Lots of additional infantry fighting vehicles, some replacement tanks, additional howitzers, communications, logistics, support and medical equipment, and even just some alternatives to all of the unarmoured civilian pickup trucks that a lot of the Ukrainian forces are still required to use for various tasks. I've talked about a shortage of dedicated medevac vehicles before in a previous episode. You could probably solve that problem with the sort of money you're talking about here. I'm half tempted to sit down and generate a spreadsheet showing how you could spread $75 billion across different line items, but I feel that would be overkill even for me. The key point is if it's focused on military assistance, $75 billion is a transformational amount of money, provided it's focused on high return on investment categories. Super blingy capabilities like THAAD have to wait, and instead the focus would have to be on munitions, mass, and metal. Okay, so that takes us to questions that are still technical in nature but don't relate to Ukraine specifically. Some are lighthearted and not particularly serious, and others have to do with nuclear weapons. This is a patron question saying basically, I'm curious about the role and value of tactical nuclear weapons on the modern battlefield. Are they worth producing in the 21st century? Now look, I'm not a nuclear strategist, and Australia hasn't made a decision to invest in a tactical nuclear arsenal, as far as we know, but I still think there are some observations we can make here, and it's an interesting question. There are countries around the world that are spending a lot of money producing a next generation or refurbing their existing tactical nuclear weapons and the delivery systems that go with them. That's often not a cheap and affordable exercise. As we talked about in the nuclear modernization episode, the US is paying $20+ million for an airdropped nuclear weapon. That's the B-61 that can be dropped from the F-35 and forms the basis of the nuclear sharing agreements with NATO and Europe. But it is generally believed that the Russians have far more tactical nuclear warheads available in Europe than NATO does. And because the Russian practice is generally to make sure that anything larger than an RPG-7 is capable of taking a nuclear warhead, a direct comparison of delivery systems wouldn't even be close. So the question is, why are people building them and do they have a role? And the key thing to say up front here is the argument is about tactical weapons specifically. No one is really disputing the value, in inverted commas, of nuclear weapons in a strategic role. One of the big distinguishing factors for a nuclear weapon is just how much destructive energy you can fit into a small package. When deployed against a city, kilotons or megatons equivalent in explosive yield is absolutely horrifying, in part because cities represent such concentrations of value. They're things that a government or a society are really going to want to protect almost at all costs. But military forces in the field that might be targeted by tactical nukes don't tend to concentrate the same way people in an apartment building might, and while stepping into a fridge won't bloody save you from a nuclear blast, a hardened bunker or armoured vehicle might, at least at a sufficient distance. So against dispersed military targets, a lot of the explosive energy in a tactical weapon is going to be, for lack of a better term, wasted. And so if you want to do a militarily significant amount of damage to the opposing force, you're probably going to have to use a lot of nukes. I have a CIA assessment on screen there looking at Soviet nuclear planning in the 1970s. That established a range for Soviet nuclear weapons usage, but generally speaking, it was roughly or just over 1 nuclear weapon per kilometre of front. So if the Russians were working from the Soviet playbook along the entire Ukrainian front, you're talking 1,200 plus nuclear weapons, or about twice Total War Pharaoh's current player count. Start getting into the political and economic realities of firing off 1,200 nuclear weapons, and they start to seem, I'd argue, less and less efficient. Assuming all of those strikes were done using relatively cheap weapons, like the B-61 gravity bomb at about $20 million per piece, then for the same purchase price as your 1,200 nuclear strikes, you could have 24,000 cruise missile strikes, almost 200,000 Gimli strikes, or enough FPV drones to block out the sun. Then you have to account for all the ancillary costs and limitations around the nuclear weapon. To have nukes, you need to have a nuclear weapon production complex. That's expensive. You need special security and control arrangements around those tactical nuclear weapons, down to how they're stored, how they're armed, how they're assembled, how they're released. And while all that costs a lot of money, you have to do it lest your tactical nuclear weapon become some non-state actor's strategic weapon. And so during the so-called revolution in military affairs, a lot of thinkers came to the same conclusion. In a lot of military use cases, before you even get into the nuclear taboo, the political blowback of trying to deploy and use nuclear weapons, often in simple, practical and economic terms, precision is just better. And so you end up with yet another case that highlights the dichotomy of nuclear weapons in the 21st century. They are at once the most devastating weapons that human beings have ever designed and put into service, and when you think about things like mutually assured destruction, they're still meta-defining in a strategic sense. But because of their cost, specialist requirements, the taboo around their use, and a dozen other factors, in a lot of cases you could argue they're also kind of useless. They work as strategic deterrents, sure, but Russia, the possessor of the greatest tactical nuclear arsenal on the planet, hasn't been able to use them at all in Ukraine. And those warheads and the systems to deliver them did not come cheap. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the tactical nuclear weapon is entirely dead, it just means it's become very much a niche system that only a couple of countries choose to invest in. There are still some jobs where a tactical nuclear weapon might be the best or only tool for a particular job, perhaps for escalation management, so you have something to retaliate with that isn't a city buster if your opponent is pushing you too far. That would be the thinking behind something like the French ASMPA. Or you can embrace the American line of thinking where a tactical nuclear weapon might serve as a bunker buster. I mean, all the precision in the world might not help you if the target is buried under meters of dirt and concrete. With a nuclear weapon, however, you can basically just excavate the entire area and kill the target regardless. Another role might be missile defense duty of all things, wherein you throw up a nuclear warhead to intercept incoming nuclear warheads, because ultimately shooting a maneuvering hypersonic bullet with another hypersonic bullet is pretty difficult, but when your interceptor missile is carrying a nuclear warhead, near enough can be good enough. So are there still some roles for tactical nuclear weapons for certain states? Apparently yes. Are many of those nations continuing to invest in refurbishing or even expanding those arsenals? Also yes. But in terms of investment priority, they strike me as a very specialised, expensive, almost quite niche capability that a lot of states are probably going to want to give a pass, especially when there's demand from the regular military for more conventional weapon systems that you might actually use. Alright, so next we have two questions about how defence thinking and investment planning evolves in countries over time. The first is asking me to go into the difference between a military that might be trying to build up from a regional to a super-regional force, as opposed to the requirements of one that is perhaps already globe-spanning and trying to respond to a new competitor. Gee, I have absolutely no idea what countries this question might be about. So on a completely unrelated note, I have done a video on China's military modernisation, which I hope will one day get a sequel, but here's the spark notes of how that might look different from an investment perspective. If you are trying to switch from being a regional power to a super-regional power with global power projection capability, the key difference between you and an established global force is that you need to be developing new capabilities for the first time. You probably don't have an industry that knows how to build full-sized aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines. And so those industries and their skilled workforces and all of the supporting industries and all of their skilled workforces are going to have to be developed more or less from scratch. At the same time, your military is going to have to develop a doctrine and then undergo the training to effectively use those new systems. There is nothing intuitive about operating a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, so you need to develop a doctrine and then you need to train people. This isn't just a question of money, although money is absolutely essential, it's also a question of time, some things you just can't take shortcuts on. If Saudi Arabia decided tomorrow that they were willing to pay $90 billion to build a 90,000-ton nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in Saudi Arabia within the next 3 or 4 years, then unless the lawyers get involved with some technicality bullshit like building it somewhere else, shipping it to Saudi Arabia and then bolting on the nameplate and saying it was locally assembled, then they just couldn't do it. Because the shipyards, the workforce, and the military thinking and structure to effectively operate it just isn't there. And it would take time, not just money, to build up. The benefit to being the modernising or expanding force, however, is that you don't have a lot of legacy equipment to maintain. It's a lot easier to find budget to build new carriers if you're not busy maintaining your existing ones. It's a lot easier to find the resources to learn how to do power projection when you're not spending your resources currently doing power projection. And so yes, while all else being equal, the incumbent's going to have a capability advantage, all is probably not going to be equal from an investment perspective. I hope that at least somewhat covers the question that was being asked. Question 2 was about how countries evolve their goals, doctrine and force structure in response to threats and changing circumstances, how do they do it successfully, and what are the pitfalls to avoid. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to zero in on that last bit. What are the pitfalls to avoid? Because we have sort of talked about the planning process in the past. One potential pitfall that I think has been highlighted in some publications and literature before is the importance of making sure that when you're drafting up a solution to an emerging problem, say a new strategic challenge posed by a potential competitor, that whatever review and testing process you're running does not have overly restrictive terms of reference, tests a sufficiently wide array of ideas, and doesn't have assumptions that straitjacket the result. And the reason I'm saying that is because often you can solve emerging problems by simply doing more of what you are currently doing. And if you start too focused on what you are currently doing for whatever reason, that might be basically locked in as the result from the start. For example, let's just say that Emutopia generally relies on air power to solve its problems at a tactical, operational and strategic level, and then suddenly their sworn enemies of Kiwi land invest heavily in air defences. An unduly limited strategic review process would ask the question, how many more aircraft do we need to deal with those air defences? While a broader process might test other approaches to the same problem. Can I saturate those air defences with drone swarms? Can I bring in additional ground-based fires to compensate for the loss of air power? If I go heavy on EW investments, can I jam or degrade the defences that way? It's an oversimplified example with a very narrow problem statement, but hopefully you get the picture. Whether you are talking about planning in the military, government more broadly, or the private sector, one of the biggest potential dangers when doing a study like that is to have a process that, to a greater or lesser extent, starts with the result that it wants to achieve and works its way backwards, setting terms of reference, requirements, or allocating certain personnel in a way that basically guarantees that they'll get to the correct, in inverted commas, result. I'm not saying this is something that happens all the time, but it does sometimes feel like if you handed a particular target and tactical problem to the various Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Army would say you should shell it, the Air Force would say you should bomb it, the Navy would say you should fling cruise missiles at it, by which point the Marines would already have fixed bayonets and be halfway to the objective. When you have a hammer, everything might look like a nail, and if you have advanced your career to the point that you are lord of all the hammers, it's probably because you're pretty good at using it and are going to be very attached to it. So one trick is to make sure that when you're doing planning, you have different voices with different experience and different expertise in the room. Multidisciplinary teams can be very powerful things. And when you have the hammers, screwdrivers and saws all turning up, then it might not be great news for your strategic competitors. Okay, so next, and on a slightly lighter note, I've been asked to, instead of talking about some of the most credible sources of military information on the internet, what about some of the least credible? And while it would be low-hanging fruit to just go for flagrant misinformation sites or things like that, which are obviously a problem, there is a special place of disdain in my heart for those really bad sort of top 10 lists or most powerful special forces in the world, or, those articles. You've all seen 100 of them. America, Russia, China, or country you don't like is shocked. Top 10 fighter jets in the world. Number 7 will surprise you. You know the ones. And so just for fun, and I mean just for fun, don't go harass them or anything, I want to give a quick run through US News top countries with the strongest militaries list. This purports to rank countries by their military strength, is intriguing enough that I believe it made an appearance on NCD, and the way they rank it is, if I read the methodology correctly, quite literally by survey results. In which case, I would love to talk to some of the survey respondents who contributed to this thing, because I would like to understand just how they travelled here from their alternative universes. The list starts strong with a Russia that, despite struggling to fight off a Ukraine that is largely equipped with NATO's Cold War surplus, is nonetheless ranked higher than both the United States and People's Republic of China. Because obviously, if the prospect of flying against a handful of F-16s gives you pause, then an entire fleet of F-22s and F-35s shouldn't be any problem at all. The Belarusian military, with an annual budget of less than $1 billion and about 60,000 active personnel, outranks France. Because apparently, nuclear weapons, proven power projection capacity, more advanced equipment, air, land and sea, and much larger personnel counts doesn't mean anything if one is led by a bloke with a moustache and the other isn't. For the record, at position 12, Belarus also outranks India, a nation which, I'm fairly confident, in time of war, could muster more troops than Belarus has people. Sticking to the European Thunderdome, mighty Serbia is apparently stronger than Poland, the country which turns up to international arms shows and just says, I'll take it. Cambodia is stronger than Italy, despite Italy's defence budget being larger than Cambodia's GDP, while the military of Zimbabwe ranks considerably higher than the Hellenic Army of Greece, a NATO-standard mass mobilisation army with thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles and artillery pieces. But some of the best gold has to be near the end of the list, where Costa Rica, a country without a standing military, is ranked ahead of traditional practitioners of the neutrality through superior firepower school of thought. Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, and Singapore are all apparently powerless in the face of Costa Rica's mighty public force. Because whatever are those hundreds of thousands of heavily armed Finnish reservists to do, especially once the country starts to receive its F-35s later this decade, if faced by a bunch of riot police and their M79 grenade launchers. And I'm bringing all this up not just because I want to beat up on any particular source, but rather to identify some problems. Namely, it's really easy to publish bad information, and given this was literally a survey-driven table, it might be that that misinformation actually goes somewhere. And that's not important just because it changes how people flex on the internet. This isn't just primary school kids arguing about whose dad would beat whose dad in a fight. Expectations and perception can shape policy. Public perceptions to Russia, to the war in Ukraine, to what might happen next, to all of these things around the world may to an extent be shaped by the Russia strong meme. And while I doubt Putin was reading US News or the Global Firepower Index, it does seem like Russian leadership misunderstood the strength and capability of the Russian military before making the decision to invade. And so in an ideal world, you'd probably want decision makers and members of the public to be making their decisions based on reality. So the world doesn't have to be quite as worried about the risk of future miscalculation, and so we can all go back to preparing for the real threat, the inevitable Costa Rican world conquest attempt. Sort of pivoting off that, another question I was asked was about public education. Namely, what should nations do better to educate the public regarding defence economics and budgeting to combat disinformation regarding the use of resources, how military aid works, etc. And here it would be really self-serving to be like, yeah, I want to push defence economics into school. By the time they hit year 5, I want every kid to understand off by heart what the fundamental inputs to capability are. But honestly, I feel like that's skipping ahead about 2,000 steps. Now, obviously, I'm very grateful to those of you watching the channel, and you're probably coming at this from a bit of a different baseline. But I feel like a better general starting point would be with the basics of financial literacy. Make sure kids understand compound interest so they know the credit card is not their friend. Make sure people understand the basics of budgeting and taxation so that in most jurisdictions they understand that earning more money may increase your tax bracket, but it doesn't decrease the amount of money you bring home in most cases. And why generally buying a new car or jet ski probably isn't a responsible use of your signing or enlistment bonus. Then we can start to get to more advanced concepts. We can start talking about how government budgeting differs from personal budgeting. We can start talking about quantitative easing. Before that, you absolutely need to cover concepts like opportunity cost. And then way down the track, once Timmy can calculate the multiplier for proposed government investments and is aware of problems like crowding out in a market, then maybe finally it'll be time to start talking about the tanks. Until then, if we ever get there, the one thing that I think might be useful to the public discourse at the moment is just conveying the idea that spending $1 to manufacture something domestically and then sending that abroad is not the same thing as just giving that country $1 or setting the dollar on fire. Instead, a lot of it is being recycled or recaptured through mechanisms like taxes on wages and corporate profits. And so the real cost of $1 billion is not always $1 billion. And closing out this section with perhaps the most dangerous question of the lot, if there was one thing you wish you could get decision makers in defence economics sphere to finally understand, what is it? And you know what? A question like this is always going to be dangerous because I'm very aware of the fact there's a lot that I don't understand. But if I had to pick just one thing, one short idea, it's that quantity matters. It doesn't matter how good your design is, you don't get any effect unless you actually build it. And when you do choose to build it, there's always going to be a question over how many effectors, like missiles, that you choose to put on your platform. When you choose to control cost by playing with quantity, either by reduced platform count or reducing the number of effectors on board, you might be generating false economies. So while it's only a general rule, that's my nomination. Quantity matters. If you think you need 4 ships with 48 VLS cells each, do the modelling on 8 with 96. If you don't like the quote on 100 tanks, instead of asking for a quote on 50, ask for a quote on 400 and see if other countries will be willing to go in on a joint procurement. It may not always be possible, but I think as the war in Ukraine has shown, sometimes mass has a value all of its own. Alright, so now we're doing what I'm calling the lucky dip questions. The miscellaneous ones, the ones that have nothing to do with anything. And yet, they either got enough upvotes or came from the patrons and so get top billing. Number 1, to paraphrase, is what's a topic outside defence economics that you wish you could make a video about, but you probably won't? And here I'll throw a little preface up front. I really enjoy talking about systems and incentive structures and how they shape behaviours. Usually I'm doing that in a defence or defence economics context, but you can apply that same thinking elsewhere. So if I could do a video on anything without risk, it would be a video on how voting systems shape political cultures, behaviours, and outcomes. Because while you might be able to write off differences in politics between different democracies as just being down to cultural issues, I think it could be fascinating to look at how voting systems in, for example, the US, Australia, and maybe 1 or 2 European examples all encourage very different political cultures, behaviours, and outcomes. The incentives for would-be politicians and parties under the Australian system are very different from those under the American system. And with 2024 being a year of many, many elections, it would certainly be topical. The problem, of course, is how do you do that without people taking it as a political critique one way or the other? Somehow I don't think the algorithm would even allow me to type the title, How Voting Systems Destroy Countries. And so because I don't want to set myself or my channel on fire, I'm probably going to stick to talking about things that set other things on fire. And then we come to the most upvoted single question of all of them, beating the second place entry by literally hundreds of upvotes. Apparently what you all really, really want to know from me is whether I would rather fight 1,000 duck-sized Moskvas or 1 Moskva-sized duck. And I'll be honest, I have questions. Many, many questions. These range from why to do the mini Moskvas get mini crew to operate them, or are they just dead in the water? Ultimately, however, I did take the challenge. I figured out there's a length divisor here. I wasn't going to do a volume-based calculation, but I did a length-based divisor about 305. That is, a Slava-class cruiser is about as long as 300 average ducks, if the internet isn't lying to me. And so what I really have to weigh up here is the difference in danger between a duck the size of a cruiser or the threat posed by the heavy anti-shipping missiles on the duck-sized cruisers. Doing some very, very rough scaling, the 1,000 duck-sized Moskvas, each having 16 missiles, would represent a combined threat of 16,000 3x39mm projectiles. Now, that is smaller than a pistol round, but I'm guessing 16,000 of them might hurt. Meanwhile, that ship-sized duck is getting absolutely crushed by the realities of the square cube law and its inability to support its own weight. There is a reason that ant over there might be able to lift 20 times its own body weight, while a human might be struggling just to carry the weight of societal expectations long before they even get to the bench press. The more you scale an animal up, the less and less relative muscular strength it will have. I don't think I actually have to fight the Moskva-sized duck, I think I just have to sit there while the very offended laws of physics take out their wrath on something that is literally too big to exist given what it's made of. Alright, so with that interesting query out of the way, next up are questions about Perun, the channel. How are videos produced, how is the channel run, etc. Question 1's pretty simple, a bunch of people asking how and why did I decide to start the channel? And here the answer is surprisingly simple. Before the February 2022 invasion, I did have a small YouTube channel, on which, just as a hobby, I published gaming content. It obviously wasn't my job, but it did mean I had a channel. Then, when the invasion kicked off, I was watching the news a lot, and to be honest, got really, really angry. Because in my view, a lot of the coverage I was seeing was using inaccurate or deceptive figures to describe the strength of the Russian military, and to an extent the Ukrainians as well, making it seem like much more of a David and Goliath struggle than I thought it was, and that the narrative, especially early on, was very much of an inevitable Russian victory. And I was looking at this, thinking about everything I already knew about the Russian military and their budget, and I just had a real man yells at cloud moment. Over the course of a couple of days, I quickly strapped together a basic presentation, a couple of core ideas, and then because I had no real other way to get this thing out into the void, I just loaded up my gaming channel, uploaded the video, and that became what you all now know as All Bling No Basics, where I basically put forward some of my predictions and the data behind it, and that was that. I didn't think anyone was interested in defense economics, defense budgets, or that sort of analysis. I didn't really think anyone would watch the video, especially since, in terms of production value, it's mostly a single take recorded on a pretty basic microphone. But ultimately, I won the algorithm lottery, people decided to watch, and the channel evolved from there. I need to pay a special thanks here actually to Nicholas Moran, the chieftain, because as the channel started to pick up, but before it had really exploded, he on his own initiative, on completely his own bat, reached out and basically said, hey, see what you're doing. Do you want someone to just help you out and teach you the basics of YouTube 101? How does the system work? What can you do? What can't you do? Because frankly, in those early days, I was just wandering in the dark. And the things he took me through on his own time, asking nothing in return, were absolutely invaluable. Over time then, of course, the channel continued to grow. It demanded more and more time. But at the same time, especially thanks to the patrons, it was beginning to generate revenue. And so while for most of the time that Defense Economics Perun has been a thing, I've been working full-time at the same time, eventually I was able to dial back the work hours somewhat so I could continue the channel without completely burning out. And so if you wonder why I thank the patrons so often, saving me from burnout is near the top of the list. Next question, how are videos produced? And the answer is each presentation moves through a couple of stages before you see it, and there are multiple presentations on the go at any given time. So I think at the moment there are around 16 different videos in different stages of production, and they basically progress like this. You start in passive development, where you know you probably want to do a topic, but all you're really doing is monitoring, collecting information, and often going after the basics of what you're going to need. What are the relevant budgets? What's the relevant data sources? Gathering all that up. And that's usually a lot of information per unit of time invested. Then, once I'm convinced it's time to actually finish off a topic and do it, it moves into active development. And so at this point, I'll take a presentation that might be 70% complete, but has some gaps in it, and I'll go out and I'll actively try and close those gaps specifically. If I need to test a thesis with experts, I'll do it at this point. If I need to buy some satellite imagery to verify something, this is where I'll do it. Then, once all that's together in the form of notes and spreadsheets, etc., it all goes into a PowerPoint. I don't script these videos, and I probably don't physically have the time to do so. Instead, just as you might to a non-YouTube audience, I present using the PPT and maybe a couple of scribbled notes, maybe an Excel sheet as my speaking notes. That recording then goes to Sound Guy and a couple of other parties for review and eventually becomes that week's release. By doing it this way, by trying to make sure that the time commitment per episode is as efficient as possible, I have found that it is practical to be putting out a finished product every week. Although, trust me, I am very aware that the only reason that works is because you let me work in the medium I know, which is PowerPoint, rather than asking me to spend the time on things like fancy graphics and animations. So for that fact, as with many others, thank you very much. I also got some questions about the team. It's a pretty lean operation, but I couldn't do it without them. You've got a sound guy who puts up with my tendency to record on potato mics in random hotel rooms, so he's an absolute legend. Then the person responsible for all the manual subtitles you read, also a complete legend. And there's an agent who basically serves to protect me from phishing scams pretending to be potential sponsors. Then if you want to talk a little more broadly, there's this wider network that sort of emerged over the life of the channel. These are usually people who have reached out or have made contact with, who are experts in their relevant fields, and are willing to help out from time to time if I've got questions about a particularly technical area. So if I'm going through a manual or I have questions about F-16, for example, I can ask questions of an F-16 pilot. If I want to talk about nuclear strategy, check the hypothesis with a nuclear strategist. And then, of course, when I want to talk about Ukraine, having contacts there is pretty much essential. All these people are really important to the channel. And in rare cases, I think twice so far, I've actually gone so far as to pay for a significant bit of research to be done to make sure that I'm confident enough in a video that I'm happy to publish it. For the overwhelming part, however, research, content generation, that's my job. It's usually me finding the evidence, crunching the data, drafting the contention. And so if there's ever a doozy of a mistake on the channel, odds are it's probably mine. Finally, there is usually one last review before a video goes public. And for safety reasons, that's actually usually done by close family. It's just safer, I think, not to be sending around stuff that might contain serious bloopers or have metadata that I forgot to remove or something like that. And so there are some people in the family who have gotten very, very acquainted with just how many typos I can fit into the average presentation. Building on the sourcing question, someone asked how much do I rely on open source intelligence and how much could my parent or grandparents or great-grandparents have done trying to do something similar in previous wars? This is, I think, a fantastic question and highlights just how different the time we live in is. The information and tools we have available to us now to do analysis from afar is so far beyond what was available even 50 years ago. It's drone camera footage, it's people with their mobile phones and internet connections. And it's the fact that if I am being told that a particular target was destroyed by a cruise missile on a particular date, then it is literally within my power to break out my credit card and pay for a satellite to take an image of that location so I can see for myself whether it is still there or whether it is gone. I can track the drawdown in artillery and armoured vehicles in Russian storage yards month to month. I can pull up a satellite-based fire detection system in order to map fires across the front, and generally do things that were beyond even the capacity of the superpowers half a century ago. Technology means it has never been easier to gather open source intelligence. But at the same time, some of those same technologies, like the internet, mean it has never been cheaper or easier to spread disinformation. So when you are trying to collect in open sources, you do have to be careful because there's a lot of bullshit out there. And it takes a lot longer to debunk said bullshit than it does to just invent more of it. And then for some reason or another, I actually got a couple of well-being-centric questions. Namely, how do I take a holiday and how do I deal with some of the more confronting things I see when researching videos? The first one is pretty simple. If I want to take a week off, I need to find a way to produce 2 videos in 1 week. That is not easy, requires an insane amount of overtime, but I have done it before. If I just want a day or 2 off, I can record a simpler topic that doesn't need as much research. You know, kind of like a Q&A episode. The weekly schedule is important to me. I feel that if patrons are putting up money, they should get their 4 videos per month, for example. And so while the release date might move back or forward a day or 2, not even COVID's been enough to knock me off the schedule entirely. Then on the second question about confronting content, so photography, video, drone footage, etc., I think it's an important question, and I think it's also important that people aren't blasé about it. Some of this stuff can very much affect people. For my part, long before the channel took off, I'd been in roles that required dealing with some very confronting stuff, and so I'd already had the benefit of going through some training and getting used to it. But just as a general advisory, I'd say if you do go looking at some of the stuff that's out there, viewer discretion is very much advised. Okay, so from here I promise we're going to lighten up for a little bit and probably go a little bit faster because I know the time is getting on. And here I basically got a question, Perun, what can you tell us about us, the Perun audience? And the answer is, besides your appreciation for defense economic PowerPoints being legendary, thanks to YouTube analytics, I can tell you a bunch. To give you some numbers, in any given 90-day period, there might be somewhere between 1.6 and just over 2 million people who watch the channel, 1 to 1.2 million of you who watch more than one video, and then within that million, there are about 480,000 subscribers that account for about 65% of total view time. That subscriber number is getting very close to 500,000, which is not something I ever thought I'd say. In terms of what I can tell you demographically, compared to the broader YouTube audience, you tend to be slightly older. A clear majority of you are 35 or over, and more than a third are 45 or over. The biggest countries in terms of viewer base are perhaps unsurprisingly the US and UK number 1 and 2. but it's actually Germany that takes the third position, vielen Dank, and despite the populations being relatively similar, there are significantly more people watching in the Nordic countries than there are in Australia. Ukraine and Russia are further down the list, accounting for maybe 100,000 views in a given period, and the two biggest viewership countries outside either Europe or Five Eyes are the Philippines and India. But if you adjust the number of views for population, a new leader emerges, with the highest number of channel views per unit population being Guyana in first, Finland in second, and Sweden and Denmark in third and fourth. 3 final tidbits that you might find interesting. Firstly, adjusting for population, viewership tends to be higher in cities with a significant military footprint. Secondly, the demographics for the Patreon supporters is even more international than the YouTube audience base. And finally, in what I'm sure must be the shock of the century to all of you, the audience does skew somewhat male. So, to round out the questions on the channel, what next? These were questions like, how long can this continue? Will you run out of things to talk about? Or what would you cover if the war in Ukraine finished tomorrow? And mate, let me tell you, if the war in Ukraine ended tomorrow on good terms, I would be bloody overjoyed. There is no video I want to make more than an update on Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. And beyond that, there is this long list of topics that I would like to cover. I want to talk a lot more about the international arms markets. I want to round out the analysis of national defense strategies. I want to do more first principles and analysis pieces. I want to do deep dives into procurement disasters or ongoing programs. Basically, I would like to do more videos like the race for 6th generation fighters, or the defense strategy for small nations, or the Destroys Army series, that sort of stuff. But I will keep covering Ukraine and the Red Sea and other events like it because they matter, because they affect millions of people and they represent history being made before our very eyes. And so while I look forward to what the content might be like after those wars are over, there's always going to be a priority there in the here and now. Then in terms of how long the channel continues, that one I don't really know. There's always going to be a trade-off between the channel and the more professional side of things. There's plenty of roles I can do while maintaining the channel, but there's also some that would be mutually incompatible. And some of those roles potentially could be very cool and very rewarding. But in the here and now, what I want to do is to keep the channel going and to continue to improve it. And so as long as the audience is there, the patrons have my back, and I think I might have something interesting to say, my plan is to keep going. Final bonus question of the section has to do with Emutopia and Kiwiland. And here the question is, quote, does the Perun cinematic universe have a wider lore that its listeners don't know about, or do you just use Emutopia and Kiwiland whenever you need an example? And honestly, the answer to this question is both. Originally, Emutopia's constant quest for military dominance was basically just something I used to pull an example from whenever I needed it, but now that the countries have become recurring characters, I've tried to make sure the narrative is at least coherent. There may need to be a retcon in the future, but for the moment the goal is to have at least 60% fewer plot holes than the latest Star Wars trilogy, so as long as I remain at least loosely tethered to the laws of reality, I reckon we'll be okay. At least as long as I never have the Kiwi Navy forget which way up is, despite the presence of gravity. Moving on, for better or worse, it's time for some questions about me. Bearing in mind that it's still very important to me that I remain anonymous, so there's going to be a lot of things I can't answer here. First set of questions were all very origin story-esque. Where is the family from? Why the name Perun? That sort of thing, so let's go through them. In terms of where the family came from, all Europeans before they came to Australia, with the majority being Croatian. In terms of involvement with the military, 3 out of the 4 grandparents served, everything from short-term conscripted through to career. And as for where the Perun name came from, you've got to credit my pa on that one. Growing up, I spent a lot of time at my Barker and Pa's place, and so by the time I was 5, my pa made bloody sure I knew how to preserve meats, operate power tools, and had picked up my fair share of Slavic mythology. Years later, I needed an online name. I went with Perun, and so the channel just kind of inherited it later because of those old stories. Sort of an extending question I was asked on that was, how did you experience the Croatian War of Independence, and how much was your career choice influenced by it? Now, for those of you who don't know, I've often joked about just how shit the 1990s were in Russia, the former Warsaw Pact states, or the former Yugoslavia. But trust me when I say that for millions of people, the 1990s was a heck of a lot more than the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears. The Yugoslav wars went on for a number of years, with part of it being the Croatian War of Independence. Now, for me personally, I was young at the time and safely in Australia, so it was just a kind of distant, scary thing that you followed on TV. For a lot of the extended family, however, it was much closer than that. I don't think it shaped my decision to go into defence or defence economics specifically. In that respect, I think we were kind of doomed from the start. I'd grown up hearing stories about my grandparents, and then eventually got my hands on a couple of history books and Civilization too, and I think it all went from there. But there are at least 2 things I think I took away from the war and its aftermath. The first was that the human impact of conflict that you read about is very, very real. I visited Croatia soon after the fighting was over, and you still had damaged buildings, shell craters, bullet holes, and all the physical and human evidence that yes, there has been a war here, and it's cost these people. And in this field, I just think holding on to that understanding is important. The second realization was that if you're a small country or a small group, often to a great extent, your fate might not be in your own hands. Overall, the way the wars ended owed a lot to decisions made in foreign capitals. People on the ground on every side could fight as hard as they wanted, and they did. When you talk about foreign decisions around things like arms embargoes or NATO intervention, all those things had the potential to tip the balance, to change the course of history. And I'd say, frankly, I see shades of that in Ukraine now. The Ukrainians can fight hard, the Russians can make the decision to continue, but the way it all ends, that probably owes a lot to decisions made in Washington and Brussels. Next up, questions about education and background. And I know I've always been a little bit coy about this because when you're talking about specialised fields, cohort sizes can get pretty small. In terms of what I can say without being too identifiable, I spent a good number of years at university racking up the degrees, but I didn't decide to push on and get a doctorate. So I'm sorry, but it is not Dr. Perun. In terms of why defence economics, the best answer I have is because it combines different disciplines I'm interested in. I wanted to understand history and the world around me, but trying to understand history without warfare is cutting out a pretty significant piece of the puzzle, given humans' tendency to solve their problems kinetically. And frankly, given the choice, I'm not sure which of the following scares me more: a historian that hasn't studied economics, an economist that hasn't studied history, or either of them if they entirely skipped the hard sciences and forgot to go out and touch grass occasionally. The best experts I've ever worked with have often been those who keep themselves the most grounded and are very, very aware of all the things they don't know, not just the things they do. I also got the question of how does one study defence economics, and there are a lot of ways to do it, but my answer for whatever it's worth was in bits and pieces. Pick up the academic and professional building blocks first. Economics, supply chain management, finance, military history, international relations, etc. Maybe some useful skills like data analytics or production planning. And then later on, when you start to get more control over your own research work, start welding them together. And then, or probably even before then, you're going to be looking for opportunities to start applying some of those skills professionally. And if you're not much of a university person, there are plenty of opportunities to enter the workforce earlier and learn more or less on the job. In that sense, I'll admit, I got really lucky in professional terms. I've always been a civilian, never wore the uniform, but I have been on both sides of the government-private divide. And at the moment, in parallel with my work on the channel, I'm in consulting. Mostly because that's the option that gives me the greatest flexibility overall to continue doing the channel at the same time. So I might do presentations or work for both government and industry on similar topics to what you might see on the channel in a way, just as you can imagine and would probably hope at a different level of complexity and detail. So to answer another question, yes, that is where the PPT format and presentation style come from. I've taken this basic template, albeit with very different content, to clients before, because I'm sorry, left text, right image just works. In a way, parts of Starfield and Fallout 76 1.0 just didn't. I do want to stress though, there is a real limit to the overlap here. YouTube content is YouTube content, it needs to entertain and engage, which ideally any presentation should do, but it's even more important here, and so I never feel like I'm getting too close to home, if that makes sense. The final question here was, did you have any crossroads in your life where alternate paths might have led you to a very different place regarding education and professional skill set? Yes, 100%. My understanding is that in countries like the US, a minority of people actually end up working in the field that they study in, and what I thought I would be doing at the end of my education was very different from what I thought going in. So I'd say that even if you end up somewhere you didn't expect, that might well be fine, and you may just be yet to find your niche. Okay, let's pick up the pace because we're almost through what I would call the serious side of the personal questions. Question 1. Does your employer know about the channel? Are you worried? Absolutely they know. All of the employers I've worked for while working on the channel have known it exists. And my personal opinion is, frankly, if you're trying to get anywhere in the defense or defense adjacent space, deliberately concealing a bunch of activity from your employer is probably not a good start. Over the last year or two, I've had a chance to talk to some other YouTubers who work outside of their channel, and in each case, I think the answer has been the same. The employers know, they're fairly chill, and all they really want to know is that your content isn't going to pose an undue risk, and that you're not about to go completely off the deep end and tell the public your theories on the reptoid takeover of the Illuminati world government. Question 2. How have the people I work with or in my family reacted to this whole thing? Frankly, response 1 has usually been confusion at just how large the defense economics PowerPoint market is. Once people get over that, however, they're usually pretty supportive. Question 3. Do I get hate mail? The answer is yes. Overall, however, I probably get far more positive email, even from within Russia, than I do hate mail. And I want to stress here, when I say hate mail, I don't mean email that disagrees with me. I really like it when people send me arguments or evidence that challenges things that I have said or seen. Generally speaking, hate mail doesn't tend to come with citations. And then question 4, has running the channel changed your life? It has, and I am grateful for that fact every day and determined to use it as responsibly as possible. I've been handed a microphone that most people never get, and I'm determined to use it to put out good information and bad jokes. But the other side of things is just how many doors and contacts this has all opened. Normally working, you'd only meet so many people at a time. But with the channel, I've had people reaching out from everywhere, and that part of the journey has absolutely been worth it. Which leads to the final set of serious questions. How does one get into this sort of field? And you know what? I'm not sure I'm actually qualified to answer this one because my path was a bit of a weird one and there are so many different ones to take. Ultimately, even if you narrow what you're talking about just to something like procurement, it's still a very broad tent. There's the uniformed workforce, the civilian government workforce, those who work in the defence industrial base, associate entities like government research and development, and of course everyone's favourite, the consultants. So at the risk of giving some overly generic advice, and anyone else in the comments feel free to contradict me here, I feel the best way of handling this problem might be to tackle it in 2 steps. First, decide what sort of work you want to do, what sort of skills you want to exercise. Project management, evaluations, data analysis, those things never get old, for example. And then once you've decided what you want to do, figure out how to do it in the defence space. Maybe that means military, maybe that means public service, maybe that means industry, or something in between. But I'd start with what you want to do, and then figure out where you want to do it. For all the work I've done in the defence space, I did a lot outside it as well, and the skills were very much transferable. Build your skills, do good work, and never burn a bridge, unless it connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Okay, so quick bonus round to close this section out. Question 1. Are you the Economics Explained guy? It's probably just a similar accent and style, but to me you sound remarkably similar. Nope, we are very different people, but we are, I think, both guilty of sounding more than a little Australian. Question 2 was, what's your favourite food? And here I really need the team from the Balkans to back me up here. Because seriously, there's a couple of valid answers, but some clear standouts. The clear winners, as in any cooking show, are the desserts. And that's the palichinka, the crepes, and then there's the undisputed king of the dessert table at every major family event. In English, what you're looking at is a walnut roll, and it is proof that Slavs have mastered the art of alchemy, because somehow they are able to take bags of walnuts and relatively basic baking ingredients and create something that tastes like it was made out of pure joy. Unless, of course, I try to make it, in which case it just tastes like dry nut bread. I have asked my barker what she sacrifices to power her cooking black magic, but so far she's not talking. Now, if you're still with me, we're almost at the end. And this is basically where I've just grouped up some closing questions about the fun stuff. Gaming, the tabletop, and the few things I do that aren't either work or sleep. Question 1. Did you ever play tabletop war games? The answer is yes in past tense. I played some tabletop Battletech and sold my child labour to pay for a Warhammer 40k habit. Mind you, we are talking many years ago here when vehicles did not have hit points, the super special marines had not yet been invented, and all these scary and dangerous Necron units used to give up and go home if you just shot enough at the chaff. Question 2 then was, if you did play Warhammer Tabletop, what did you play? And the main answer, because I'd never want to allow an opponent to have any fun, was Mechanized Infantry Eldar. Wave Serpents with some Dire Avengers in the trunk, a Falcon with some Fire Dragons in the boot, a Seer Council on jet bikes, and the overpowered bullshit that was Eldrad on the same. Anyone who knows what any of that means, feel free to leave your angry comments below. I deserve it. Later on in uni, during the points where I still had some time, I did more TTRPG stuff, albeit with the warning that if you were going to let me GM your campaign, you better be prepared not just for combat segments, but for your weekly logistics challenge. The next question was, did you ever play EVE Online? And for those of you who don't know EVE, it's basically a very multiplayer game of spaceships and spreadsheets. So, at least for a little while, the answer was yes. And the final question was, what next for Perun Gaming, given that when I asked for these questions to be put forward, Perun Gaming was kind of on hiatus. I've now sort of started it back up, if for no other reason than by publishing my content, I force myself to take a break in game once in a while. Currently I've got a series of Rogue Trader on the run, and I expect Terra Invicta to be returning soon. So if you are interested, I will shamelessly cross-promote and leave a link in the description. And with that, I think we're done. I don't think we need a separate conclusion on something that's jumped around as much as this episode, so I'll go straight into the channel update. Originally my plan was to take 1 week off before leaping into January in a big way, but ultimately I decided what I wanted to do instead was to reflect on just what a privilege it has been to run this channel for nearly 2 years, and to take an opportunity to thank some of you who have supported the channel by answering the questions you put forward. Personally, I still don't think I'm the important story here, and I hope that the topics, the research, and the data presented in this channel can ultimately stand on their own merits. Next week, we'll be back to a more regular type of programming, and if you are a patron, expect some polling on future topic choices to be going up soon. To all of you listening, and to all of you who did listen in 2023, thank you very much, and I'll see you all again next week.